The morning sun blazed over the sprawling desert training grounds of 29 Palms, California. Heat shimmered off the sand and gravel, twisting the horizon into a wavering mirage. Dust clung to the boots of every Marine who stood in formation, their rifles slung across their shoulders, their eyes darting curiously toward the unexpected guest approaching the range. He wasn't dressed like them. While the Marines wore their pressed digital camis and bore the sharpness of routine, the old veteran moved with deliberate calm in faded olive fatigues that looked like they had been through 100 washes too many. His face was worn, creased by years of sun and storms, and a thin scar curved just under his jawline. His gait was steady, almost too steady for a man his age. In his right hand, clutched with practiced familiarity, he carried the thing that made every young recruit laugh, an old rifle with a stock painted a dull, faded orange. At first glance, it looked ridiculous. The weapon had scratches along the barrel, small chips across the scope mount, and that garish orange paint made it look like something stolen from a sporting goods aisle. Compared to the sleek, black modern rifles slung across Marine shoulders, this weapon seemed closer to a hunting toy than a military firearm. Within seconds, the whispers started. "Is he serious?" One young Marine muttered to his buddy, stifling a chuckle. "Looks like a Nerf gun," another quipped under his breath. "I bet it jams before he even fires," someone else added, sparking a ripple of laughter. The joke spread quickly, and within moments, the veteran had become a walking punchline. The recruits smirked openly, nudging each other as he passed, while the older NCOs shook their heads but said nothing. To them, the situation was obvious. The general had arranged some sort of demonstration, maybe a morale stunt, and this old man, whoever he was going to try and impress them with a trick shot or a story. But the veteran didn't flinch. He didn't glance at the smirking faces or acknowledge the chuckles behind him. His eyes were fixed on the far-off targets, shimmering faintly in the rising heat. Every movement he made was unhurried but purposeful. He carried the orange rifle the way a man carries something sacred, never fumbling, never careless. He paused only once, adjusting the sling on his shoulder before continuing his quiet walk across the gravel toward the firing line. At the back of the formation stood General Robert H. Kessler, arms folded behind his back, his cap tilted slightly downward against the glare. Unlike the recruits, the general wasn't laughing. His sharp eyes followed the veteran with an expression unreadable to most, though those who knew him well might have caught the faintest flicker of respect in his gaze. Kessler remembered the man. Decades earlier, when the sands of another desert had been choked with smoke and fire, this veteran had carved his name into history with the kind of marksmanship others only whispered about. Stories of shots that stretched beyond the limits of reason, of calm precision under enemy fire, of moments where his rifle had decided the fate of entire squads. The general hadn't seen him in years, and he suspected many of these young Marines didn't even know his name. To them, he was just an old-timer with a funny-looking rifle. To Kessler, he was a legend walking. The laughter grew as the veteran finally reached the firing bench. He crouched slowly, lowering himself with the care of a man who respected every bone in his body, and set the orange rifle gently on the stand. Dust swirled around him as he unlatched a small pouch from his belt and began his routine. The Marines leaned in, amused. He didn't unpack fancy equipment. No laser rangefinders, no electronic wind gauges, none of the modern gadgets that had become standard in sniper schools. Instead, he pulled out a soft strip of cloth frayed at the ends and tied it around his index finger. When the wind shifted, the fabric fluttered. He studied it for a moment, nodded once, then turned his attention back to the distant targets. "Look at this guy," one Marine whispered, "using a rag instead of a computer. Grandpa thinks it's 1943. A ripple of chuckles followed. But the general's sharp glance silenced them quickly. The veteran said nothing. His breathing slowed as he adjusted the scope, twisted a knob, and sighted downrange. Each movement was deliberate, controlled, as though he'd done it 1,000 times in battlefields, far harsher than this. His hands never shook. He seemed to merge with the rifle itself, his cheek settling against the worn stock, his finger brushing the trigger guard lightly, not yet pressing. For a long moment, there was only silence, the kind of silence that presses against your ears in the desert heat. Even the wind seemed to pause. The Marines watched, some grinning, some skeptical, a few oddly uneasy, though they couldn't explain why. The old man didn't look like he was about to fail. He looked like he was about to remind them all why the general had brought him here. Kessler finally broke the silence with a voice that cracked like a whip. Target, 4,200 meters. The words dropped like a bombshell. Every Marine stiffened. Heads turned, jaws dropped. Someone muttered, "That's impossible," under their breath. Another scoffed, "Not with that thing." A murmur swept through the formation, disbelief colliding with nervous laughter. No one had ever attempted such a shot here, not in training, not in demonstrations, not ever. But the veteran didn't react. He adjusted his grip, closed one eye, and exhaled slowly. His orange rifle, ridiculous just moments before, now seemed like an extension of something ancient and dangerous. The Marines, despite themselves, fell quiet. Their jokes died on their tongues. They could feel it in the air, the way tension thickened, the way even the desert seemed to hold its breath. The old man was ready. And though most of them didn't realize it yet, this was the moment when laughter would turn into silence, and silence would give way to awe. The orange rifle rested on the firing stand, like a relic pulled from another century. Its chipped paint and battered stock stood in stark contrast to the polished weapons carried by the Marines surrounding the range. The sun glinted off its barrel, revealing tiny nicks and scars, battle wounds etched into metal. To the young recruits, it was laughable. To the veteran, it was home. The whispers began again, softer this time, but still edged with ridicule. 4,000 meters? He won't even see the target. Guy's probably blind as a bat. That rifle looks like it should be in a pawn shop. The Marines closest to the firing line grinned, nudging each other as though they were watching some kind of comedy act. The absurdity of it all was too rich. The general had ordered them to witness this. They were expecting advanced marksmanship, maybe a demonstration of modern sniper tactics, not some wrinkled veteran and his orange toy rifle. And yet, there was something unnerving about the way he ignored them. The veteran's focus never wavered. His hands moved slowly, deliberately, as he checked the rifle's scope and adjusted the elevation. His movements weren't flashy, but they carried the quiet confidence of someone who had done this hundreds of times under far greater pressure. He didn't glance at the Marines. He didn't acknowledge their whispers. It was as though they weren't even there. He was alone with the target. The general remained at the back of the group, silent as stone. His presence loomed over the recruits like a shadow, though most were too caught up in their own smugness to notice. He knew this man's history. He knew the kind of shots he had taken in jungles, deserts, and mountains half a world away. Kessler had seen firsthand what happened when this orange rifle was in his hands. The recruits had not. And so they laughed. One Marine, tall and broad-shouldered with the kind of swagger that comes from being top of his training class, leaned closer to the others and smirked. "I'll put down $50, says he can't even hit paper. Any takers?" Hands shot up eagerly. Bets flew across the ranks: money, favors, push-up penalties. To them, it was a sure thing. The old man was walking into humiliation, and they were going to profit from it. But a smaller group of Marines, the ones who had been in combat zones or trained under seasoned NCOs, stayed quiet. They didn't laugh. Something about the veteran's calmness unsettled them. His stillness wasn't clumsy hesitation. It was control. Control so absolute that it silenced the desert around him. The veteran tilted his head slightly, peering through the old scope. He adjusted a single knob, then tested the trigger pull with the gentlest pressure. His breathing slowed, chest rising and falling like a metronome, set to a rhythm no one else could hear. He wasn't trying to impress them. He wasn't here for their approval. He was here for the shot. The Marines shifted uneasily as they realized how focused he was. The laughter died down, though the whispers remained. Some still grinned, trying to convince themselves this was nothing more than a circus act. But in the pit of their stomachs, a few began to feel the creeping suspicion that something was about to happen, something that would unravel every bet, every joke, every careless remark. The general finally spoke, his voice carrying across the range with sharp authority. Eyes front. Watch and learn. The recruits snapped to attention, their smirks fading under the weight of his tone. They had heard that voice before, usually when discipline was being delivered with surgical precision. None dared laugh after that. The veteran lowered his cheek against the orange stock, aligning himself fully with the weapon. His finger brushed the trigger lightly, not pressing, just feeling its resistance. He let the desert heat settle around him, the shimmer of the horizon becoming part of his vision. He studied the mirage, read the wind through the rag tied to his finger, and made the smallest of corrections. The rifle was old, yes, but it was his. He knew every quirk, every imperfection. He trusted it more than he trusted men. Behind him, a Marine whispered nervously, "Maybe he's actually gonna try it." Another scoffed, "Try, sure. But hit it? Not a chance." Their words were bravado, but their voices lacked conviction. The longer they watched him, the more their confidence eroded. There was no trembling in his hands, no hesitation in his movements. He wasn't fumbling or guessing. He was preparing with the assurance of someone who had walked this road before and returned alive. Finally, the veteran exhaled. It was a slow, measured breath, the kind that emptied not just his lungs, but the tension from his entire body. He became still, the kind of stillness that unnerves even the most confident soldier. The orange rifle didn't look ridiculous anymore. In that moment, it looked like an extension of something much larger: experience, patience, mastery. For a heartbeat, the desert seemed to fall silent with him. The Marines waited. Some leaned forward instinctively, as though closing the distance with their eyes would help them understand what was unfolding. The general's gaze never wavered, fixed on the man at the line. The old veteran was ready, and for the first time, even the most skeptical recruit began to realize this wasn't going to be funny. This was going to be unforgettable. The desert wind rose suddenly, carrying a thin veil of dust across the range. It whispered through the lines of Marines, stinging their eyes and drying their throats, but the veteran did not flinch. His cheek pressed firmly against the orange rifle's worn stock, and his eyes remained locked on the horizon, steady as stone. Around him, the sound of murmuring Marines ebbed and flowed like restless waves. They were trying to make sense of what they were seeing. For many of the recruits, the old man was still nothing more than a relic, his methods outdated, his equipment laughable. But there was something unsettling about the way he moved. He was too calm. Every adjustment he made was precise, without hesitation. He wasn't fumbling. He wasn't guessing. He was calculating. The strip of cloth tied to his finger fluttered gently as the breeze shifted again. To the untrained eye, it looked ridiculous, like an old superstition, a meaningless ritual. But the general knew better. That simple cloth told him what no piece of electronics could: the fickle truth of the wind, the subtle currents that could carry a bullet off course across miles of open desert. The veteran watched it, studied it, then nodded faintly to himself, as though confirming something only he understood. One Marine whispered nervously, "Why is he using that rag?" "We've got kestrels, we've got range finders." "Because he's ancient," another muttered back. "He probably thinks satellites are witchcraft." "Shut it," barked the sergeant, glaring at them. Even he, hardened and skeptical, could feel the gravity building around the old man's stillness. The veteran's breathing slowed. Inhale, exhale, pause. The rise and fall of his chest was deliberate, each cycle longer than the last. He was tuning himself, aligning his body with the rifle, until man and weapon became indistinguishable. His hands, weathered by decades of service, showed no tremor. The Marines began to notice. The laughter had all but stopped now. Instead, a quiet tension rippled through the ranks. Their jokes had fallen flat against the wall of his composure. It was like shouting insults at a mountain, pointless, futile. Some of them shifted on their feet, uncomfortable in the silence, their bravado shrinking under the weight of something they didn't fully understand. For the first time, doubt crept in. What if he wasn't a joke? The general, standing with arms folded behind his back, watched closely. He recognized every tiny gesture, every adjustment, every pause. They were the hallmarks of a marksman at the edge of perfection. He had seen this before, years ago, in places far more unforgiving than this training ground. Watching it now was like stepping back into those moments, when one man's skill had turned chaos into survival. The veteran shifted slightly, lowering his body further against the earth. His elbows dug into the gravel, grounding him, locking his frame into a position of total control. The rifle settled into his shoulder like it belonged there. The desert stretched before him, vast and unforgiving. The target, barely visible, shimmered on the horizon like a mirage. To most eyes, it was little more than a speck. To him, it was clear. He narrowed his focus, and the world around him began to fade. The sound of Marines shifting in their boots, the rustle of gear, the low murmur of disbelief, all of it receded into nothingness. He saw only the distance, the wind, the mirage, and the shot waiting to be taken. A young Marine leaned forward, his brow furrowed. He had been among the loudest laughers earlier, but now his voice was subdued. "He doesn't look nervous." "Of course not," his buddy replied with a smirk, though it lacked conviction. "He probably doesn't even know where he is." But the first Marine shook his head. "No, look at him. He's locked in." They weren't wrong. The veteran wasn't here to prove himself to anyone. He had nothing left to prove. He wasn't chasing glory or applause. He was simply doing what he had always done, reading the earth, feeling the air, preparing the shot as naturally as breathing. He adjusted the scope again, just a fraction of a turn. His eye pressed against the glass, and the distant target came into sharper relief. Another gust of wind swept across the range. The cloth on his finger danced, then settled. He read it in silence, shifting his aim ever so slightly. The correction was small, nearly imperceptible to anyone watching, but it carried the weight of survival instincts honed over decades. The Marines had seen demonstrations before modern snipers, showcasing gadgets, instructors boasting of precision shots. None of them looked like this. None of them radiated this kind of control, this unshakable certainty. For the first time, many of the recruits stopped seeing the orange rifle as ridiculous. Instead, it looked intimidating. It wasn't the paint or the scratches that mattered. It was the way he wielded it, the way it seemed like an extension of his will. The veteran exhaled again, longer this time, until his chest barely moved. The silence stretched. A few Marines exchanged uneasy glances. The bravest among them wanted to break it with a joke, but the words caught in their throats. The air was too heavy now, too thick with anticipation. Even the desert seemed to understand. The wind stilled, the heat shimmer quieted. The horizon hung motionless, as though the world itself was waiting for what came next. The general's eyes narrowed. He could see it, the final moment before commitment, the instant when everything aligns. The old man was ready. 4,200 meters, the general repeated, his voice calm but commanding. The Marines froze. They had heard the distance before, but now, in this silence, the weight of it pressed down on them. 4,200 meters. A shot beyond imagination. A shot that defied the limits of even their most advanced rifles. The veteran didn't flinch. He adjusted one last time, then stilled completely. His finger brushed the trigger with the gentlest of touches. His breathing locked into a rhythm that bordered on unnatural. He wasn't aiming anymore. He was becoming the shot. The Marines held their breath. The desert held its breath. The general, though calm on the surface, felt the same familiar tightening in his chest he had felt decades earlier, in another place, watching this same man prepare for something no one else could believe possible. And then the silence broke not with laughter, not with whispers, but with the crack of the orange rifle firing its first and only round. The shot had begun. The crack of the rifle shattered the silence. It wasn't just a sound, it was a ripple that rolled across the range, sharp and commanding, cutting through the air like lightning splitting the sky. For a fraction of a second, everyone froze. The Marines' eyes widened, their laughter silenced, their breath caught. Even the desert seemed to pause, its winds stunned into stillness. The veteran remained motionless, his cheek still pressed to the worn orange stock, his finger steady on the trigger's curve. He didn't follow the bullet with frantic eyes. He didn't strain to see if it connected. He simply stayed still, as if the shot had already ended the moment it left the barrel. But for the Marines, time stretched unbearably. The bullet's journey became myth in motion. Across the blistering expanse, 4,200 meters of desert stretched between shooter and target. Heat waves shimmered above the ground, distorting distance, bending light. To the naked eye, the target was no more than a speck against the horizon, a faint square of metal that might as well have been the moon. The bullet tore through that distance unseen, carving a path through hot air and invisible currents. The cloth tied to the veteran's finger had whispered the truth of those currents, and his adjustments had been subtle but perfect. Where others would have been carried off course by the faintest breeze, his round flew true. Seconds passed. 1, 2, 3. The Marines leaned forward unconsciously, squinting into the horizon as if their vision could chase the shot. Their hearts pounded. Some clutched their rifles tighter, others chewed their lips, waiting for the sound they weren't sure would ever come. And then clang, faint but undeniable. A metallic ring drifted back across the desert like the echo of a bell in a cathedral. It was soft at first, almost unbelievable, but as it settled into their ears, realization struck. The target had been hit. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The Marines stood rooted in disbelief. The sound reverberated in their skulls, rewriting what they thought was possible. 4,200 meters. A shot that most of them considered fiction, the kind of legend you heard in sniper folklore, but never expected to witness. Yet they had heard the clang themselves. The old man with the orange rifle had struck it. Gasps broke the silence first. No way. Did he? Check it. Check it. Binoculars were snatched up, scopes raised. Marines scrambled, bumping into each other in their urgency. Through magnified glass, the truth revealed itself. A perfect strike, the round buried into the steel plate that now bore a fresh scar at its center. The impossible had happened. The Marines erupted in disbelief. Some shouted. Others laughed nervously, unable to process it. A few stood silent, their faces pale, as though they had witnessed sorcery. Moments ago, they had mocked the orange rifle as a toy, ridiculed the veteran as outdated. Now their world had shifted on its axis. But the old man didn't react. He lowered the rifle slowly, gently resting it back on the stand, as though it were something fragile. His movements carried no gloating, no satisfaction. His face betrayed nothing beyond the same calm it had held since he arrived. For him, the shot had been routine, an act performed 100 times before in harsher places. The general smiled faintly. He had expected this. He knew the man was capable of it. But watching it unfold in front of a crowd of doubting recruits still filled him with pride. It was more than a demonstration. It was a reminder that greatness doesn't fade with age, and that mastery endures long after the battles are fought. The recruits turned toward each other, their voices overlapping in a storm of disbelief. That was 4,000 meters. No one can do that. No one. He just did. Holy hell. The bravest among them, the Marine who had bet $50 earlier, muttered under his breath. His face was flushed, his confidence shattered. That shouldn't even be possible. Maybe not for you, another Marine replied, still staring in awe at the distant target. One by one, the young men who had mocked the rifle now stared at it with reverence. The orange paint no longer looked ridiculous. Instead, it seemed like a banner, a symbol of something they didn't fully understand, but instinctively respected. The general stepped forward, his boots crunching on gravel. His voice carried, steady and firm. You've just witnessed what most of you thought was impossible. You saw a man do in seconds what technology alone cannot guarantee. You mocked his rifle. You mocked his age. And yet he just proved what experience, patience, and discipline look like. The Marines listened in silence. None dared interrupt. The general's gaze swept across them, hard and sharp. Remember this. Skill is not measured by the shine of your weapon or the gadgets you carry. It is measured by results. And results don't care how modern your gear is. They care how steady your hand is, how calm your heart is, and how much you've learned from the fire of battle. The veteran still hadn't spoken. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than any speech. For him, this wasn't about showing off. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about teaching without words, letting the shot itself carry the message. The desert, once filled with mocking laughter, was now a place of reverence. The Marines who had ridiculed him moments earlier now stood straighter, their eyes lowered, their respect earned in the space of a single bullet's journey. The clang of steel still echoed in their minds, a sound they would never forget. And in the stillness that followed, the legend of the old veteran with the orange rifle began to take root. The desert range was no longer filled with laughter. Instead, it carried the faint ring of steel struck at impossible distance, an echo that seemed to cling to every grain of sand. The Marines stood frozen, their earlier swagger evaporated. The clang had silenced not just their voices, but their very doubts. It was as if the desert itself had conspired to hush them, forcing them to absorb what had just happened. The veteran lowered his rifle, the orange paint glinting under the ruthless sun. He brushed the sand from his sleeve and leaned back slightly, his face unreadable. Not a word, not a smirk. He simply stood, a calm pillar amid the chaos of stunned recruits. The general's eyes scanned the Marines. His jaw was set, but the corners of his mouth threatened to betray a smile. He had seen disbelief before new soldiers confronted with truths their training never prepared them for. But this was different. It wasn't a new tactic or an unexpected drill. It was history firing itself across a desert plain. The Marines fidgeted. Some stole nervous glances at each other. Others whispered in half-broken sentences. That's not no one? You saw it. Yeah, but 4,200. Steel doesn't lie. One Marine, the same who had joked loudest earlier, finally exhaled. His voice cracked when he spoke. "Sir, how is that even possible?" The general didn't answer immediately. He let the silence stretch, forcing the question to settle in the air. Then he turned, his gaze falling on the veteran. "Why don't you tell them?" the general asked softly. For the first time since arriving, the old man spoke. His voice was low, gravelly, touched by years of sand, smoke, and distance. It carried no arrogance, no boast, just quiet authority. "Possible," he said, "is a word men use when they haven't tried hard enough." The Marines shifted, some caught off guard by the simplicity of his words. The veteran stepped forward, his boots crunching the gravel as he walked closer to them. His movements were slow but steady, the kind of pace that carried weight in every step. "You all mocked the rifle," he said, his eyes sweeping across the group. "You thought it too old, too bright, too strange to belong on a range like this. But rifles are not defined by their paint, nor by their year. They are defined by the hands that wield them. Just as men are." No one dared interrupt. "When you looked at me," the veteran continued, "you saw an old man with gray hair and worn boots. You thought age dulled skill. You thought experience was a relic. But I tell you, this experience sharpens in ways youth cannot comprehend. Every scar, every mistake, every lost friend. It all becomes part of the shot." The Marines swallowed hard. His words pressed into them deeper than any shouted order. "I didn't hit that steel because I got lucky," he said. "Luck fades. Technology malfunctions. But patience, discipline, understanding, those endure. You don't just fire a bullet. You feel the air. You read the light. You let the earth itself tell you how to aim. Then you trust your soul to follow through." The silence that followed was suffocating. One Marine blinked rapidly, trying to process it. Another clenched his jaw, ashamed of his earlier laughter. And the young man who had placed the bet rubbed the back of his neck, wishing the ground would swallow him whole. The general finally stepped in. His voice was sharp now, breaking the trance. "Listen well. You've just witnessed what textbooks don't teach. You've seen a man turn what you thought impossible into reality. He didn't do it with gadgets or drones or fancy scopes. He did it with skill that outlives wars. If you take nothing else from today, take this. Respect the men who came before you. Respect the craft. Respect the fight." The Marines nodded, almost in unison. But the general wasn't finished. He raised his hand and pointed at the scarred steel plate in the distance. That shot wasn't just a display. It was a reminder. Every one of you is here because you think you're strong, because you think you're ready. But strength isn't loud. Readiness isn't about bravado. It's about discipline, patience, and the will to endure when others quit. The veteran's expression didn't change. He didn't bask in the general's words, didn't seek acknowledgement. Instead, he looked at the young Marines with a calm sadness, as if seeing shadows of men he once knew. Then, softly, he added, "War doesn't care about your pride. It doesn't care about your jokes, your arrogance, your youth. War strips you bare. And when it does, the only thing left standing is what you've trained into your bones." That shot wasn't for me. It was for you, to remind you of what you need to survive what's coming. The words hung heavy. The recruits stood straighter now, their earlier bravado burned away. The orange rifle, once a subject of ridicule, now gleamed like a holy relic under the sun. One Marine whispered, almost reverently, "He's a legend." Another corrected him quietly, "No, he's proof legends are real." The general gave a single nod to the veteran. The old man returned it, nothing more. Between them was a respect that didn't need words. The kind built on decades of service, loss, and victories that no history book could fully capture. Then the general barked, "Fall in." The Marines scrambled into formation, sharper now, more attentive. The joking smirks were gone. Every face bore the weight of what they had just witnessed. As the veteran walked past them, one Marine instinctively snapped to attention, saluting. Others followed, one by one, until the entire line stood in silent salute. Their respect was no longer forced. It was earned, pulled from the depths of awe. The veteran didn't return the salute with ceremony. He simply touched the brim of his cap and gave a faint nod, acknowledging them not as children, but as soldiers who had finally seen what discipline meant. The desert wind picked up again, carrying sand across the range. But now, instead of mocking laughter, it carried silence filled with reverence. The shot would be remembered. But more importantly, so would the lesson. The Marines stood in rigid silence, even after formation was dismissed. The old veteran had already slung his orange rifle across his shoulder, walking slowly toward the shade of a canvas tent. His boots left shallow imprints in the sand, each step deliberate, steady, unshaken by time. The recruits' eyes followed him until he disappeared, and even then their stares lingered, as if the desert itself might whisper his story back to them. The general, meanwhile, remained still at the firing line. His gaze stayed fixed on the scarred steel plate shimmering in the distance, the impossible shot echoing not in his ears, but in his memory. He had known this man for decades. He knew the quiet gravity that walked with him. But seeing the new generation's disbelief stirred something deeper, a need for them to understand why this veteran mattered. He turned sharply. "You want to know how a man makes that shot?" The Marines snapped their attention back to him. Some nodded instinctively. Others kept their jaws tight, afraid of speaking out of turn. The general folded his arms behind his back. "That man isn't just a shooter. He's history carved into flesh. And every scar he carries tells you why that bullet struck steel." The flashback begins, the desert sun faded in his voice, and the recruits found themselves drawn into a different heat, a different battlefield. "He was in Fallujah when most of you are still in school," the general said. "Back then, there were no drones overhead to mark targets. No satellites feeding coordinates to your helmets. There was just dust, blood, and rifles that jammed in the sand." The Marines exchanged glances. Fallujah was legend in the Corps stories of house-to-house combat, IEDs in every street, an ambush that turned corners into graves. "He lost his spotter to an RPG blast," the general continued. His voice was steady, but his eyes darkened. Most men would have broken, but not him. He pulled what was left of his team together, dragged 2 wounded Marines across 200 meters of open fire, and still set up his rifle to cover the retreat. "Do you know what it takes to steady your hands when your brothers are bleeding out beside you?" The question hit like shrapnel. None of the recruits answered. The general's gaze swept across their faces. That shot today? It wasn't magic. It was muscle memory built from holding the line when everyone else thought it would collapse. He doesn't hear the wind, he feels it because he's lived in it, fought in it, bled in it. That rifle is orange because it's the same one he's carried across continents. And every layer of paint hides a place where it's been scratched, dented, nearly destroyed, but never quit. Whispers among the Marines, the recruits began murmuring, hushed now reverent. "Fallujah?" One Marine whispered to another. "He was there? Hell, my uncle said only the toughest came back from that. And he's standing right here." The bet-maker Marine lowered his head, shame burning hotter than the desert sun. He had mocked a man who had carried more weight in a single firefight than he would likely bear in his entire career. Another Marine, wide-eyed, leaned forward and muttered, "That explains it. That shot, it wasn't just training. It was everything he survived." The general's memory, the general's eyes softened as he recalled a night long ago. He and I served together in Helmand, he said, surprising the recruits. We were pinned down in a village. Night had swallowed everything, and enemy fire raked the walls like rain. We had no artillery, no support. Just one rifle and his steady hands. The memory played in his mind like it was yesterday. He remembered the veteran crawling into position, ignoring the bullets cracking inches from his helmet. He remembered how, one by one, the enemy guns went silent, each silenced by a shot that never missed. He remembered the moment he realized this quiet Marine wasn't just skilled, he was the reason dozens of men survived that night. He doesn't speak of it, the general said, his voice quieter now. But I owe him my life. More than once. And so do men buried in Arlington, who went home first because he stayed behind. The recruits stood straighter, the weight of the words pressing into their shoulders, like packs heavier than anything they'd carried. The veteran's scars under the shade of the tent, the veteran sat alone. He unbuttoned his sleeve, revealing a jagged scar that twisted down his forearm. Another ran across his collarbone, hidden beneath his shirt. His body was a map of wars fought in places these recruits couldn't pronounce, battles that would never appear in textbooks. He ran a cloth slowly over the orange rifle, polishing the steel like one might tend to a family heirloom. Each groove in the weapon carried memory. Each scratch whispered a name. To others, it was paint over rust. To him, it was everything. He remembered the smell of burned oil in Baghdad, the choking dust of Kandahar, the blood on his boots that was not his own. Every memory lived in the weight of that rifle, and every time he lifted it, those ghosts steadied his hand. The lesson back at the line, the general's voice grew firmer again. You think being a Marine is about bravado? About who can shout loudest or mock the hardest? It's not. It's about endurance. About remembering that the Corps doesn't need noise. It needs men who, when the noise fades, can still act with precision. He let the words sink in, his tone sharp enough to pierce their arrogance. That man out there, he embodies what the Corps demands. You laughed at him. You doubted him. But you'll tell your children one day you stood on a range and saw him fire. And when they ask if it was real, you'll know in your heart that legends aren't born in stories. They're made by men who refuse to quit. The Marines didn't respond. Not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't. Their throats were dry, their pride deflated, their awe overwhelming. The veteran reappeared, walking back slowly toward them, rifle slung casually as though it were weightless. The recruits parted instinctively, eyes tracking him like he was more ghost than man. And though he said nothing, his silence carried more weight than their loudest drill instructors. For the first time that day, every Marine understood. They weren't just soldiers in training. They were inheritors of a legacy, carved in steel, scars, and impossible shots. And they would never forget the man with the orange rifle. By the time the sun dipped toward the horizon, news of the impossible shot had already begun to ripple far beyond the dusty range at 29 Palms. Word traveled through official channels. First, a quiet alert sent to the general's office. A message passed between communications officers that read like a report from another world. Veteran achieves verified 4,200-meter hit on standard steel target. Weapon, vintage M40 painted orange. No modern range aids. The words alone caused a mixture of disbelief and awe. How could a single Marine, decades past his prime, accomplish what even the most advanced training and modern equipment often failed to achieve? In the Pentagon, senior officers gathered in a hushed room, a monitor showing a live feed of the range, and the Marines still assembled in stunned silence. They watched as the veteran walked calmly past the line, his rifle slung over his shoulder, indifferent to the awe surrounding him. He did what? Muttered one colonel, rubbing his temples. I've read the report 3 times, said a major. It's accurate. Shot verified. Distance, 4,200 meters. Steel plate scored perfectly. Without rangefinders? Asked a lieutenant, disbelief coloring his tone. Without any modern targeting gear, confirmed the communications officer. The room fell silent. One general, older and weathered, leaned forward. This isn't training. This isn't a demonstration. This is a reminder that skill doesn't age. Experience doesn't decay. This Marine has done something none of us could replicate on the best ranges in the world. The news spread rapidly through the chain of command. Within hours, the story had traveled from the general's office at 29 Palms to the Department of the Navy, to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Even the Pentagon's press office prepared statements, though they struggled to condense a feat that defied comprehension. The veteran's name wasn't widely known outside elite circles, but now it was poised to enter legend. Meanwhile, back at the range, the young Marines were slowly processing what had happened. They sat in groups under the fading sunlight, speaking in hushed tones, replaying the shot in their minds. "Did you see that?" whispered one recruit. "Yeah," another replied, eyes wide. "It was unbelievable. He didn't even flinch. Do you think he's real?" another asked, half in jest, half in awe. The veteran, seated a short distance away on a folding chair, simply observed them. His eyes were steady, his expression calm. He did not need to boast. He did not need to explain. The lesson had been delivered in a single extraordinary moment. The general, now surrounded by both officers and Marines, addressed the crowd. Today isn't just about a single shot. It's about respect for those who've trained, fought, and survived. This Marine demonstrates that mastery is earned through perseverance, not technology. Remember this. Talk about it. Learn from it. The young Marines nodded, internalizing the lesson, realizing the weight of what they had just witnessed. They had mocked him in the morning. Now, in the evening, every man there was changed. Word reached the media the following day. Journalists buzzed with the story, intrigued by the contrast between the bright orange rifle and the dead-on accuracy of the shot. Footage circulated of the veteran walking calmly across the range, rifle over his shoulder, while the young recruits and the general watched in reverent silence. Headlines splashed across websites and papers alike. Orange rifle, deadly precision. Veteran sniper stuns. Marines at 4,200 meters. Legend in action. Veteran shooter defies physics at 29 Palms. Despite the attention, the veteran remained detached. He did not seek fame. For him, this was a reminder to a new generation that preparation, patience, and respect for the craft mattered more than technology or bravado. Back in the Pentagon, discussions shifted from disbelief to strategy. Military analysts debated whether his methods could be incorporated into training, whether his technique could be taught to modern snipers, whether technology could even hope to replicate the instinct and calm that had delivered that shot. Some dismissed it as an anomaly, a perfect storm of skill and experience. Others saw it as proof that even in a digital age, human mastery remained irreplaceable. Meanwhile, at 29 Palms, the Marines began asking questions. They wanted to know about the veteran's experiences, his career, the moments that had forged such precision. The veteran shared some stories, though selectively, leaving out the most harrowing battles, letting the lessons speak louder than the horrors. He explained small techniques, the subtle ways wind, temperature, and mirage interact, and how intuition sharpened by years of survival can outperform any rangefinder or computer. "You don't just fire," he told them. "You feel the environment. You respect it. You let it teach you. And only then, when everything aligns, you trust yourself to act." The Marines listened intently. For the first time, the orange rifle symbolized not a relic, but a teacher, a link to the past and to lessons they could carry into their future. As the day waned, the veteran walked the range one last time, inspecting the distant steel plate. He ran a gloved hand along its edge, feeling the slight deformation left by his shot. Each dent was a story, a memory of precision under pressure, a testament to experience honed over decades. In the silence that followed, the Marines understood the unspoken truth. This was more than a display of skill. It was a moment that would define their careers. They had been witnesses to something legendary, and they knew the stories of this day would be told and retold long after they had left the desert. The general gathered the veterans and young Marines together. "Remember him," he said. "Learn from him. And never forget that in the course, the most important tools aren't the rifles, the optics, or the gadgets. They're patience, respect, and the will to do what others cannot." As twilight fell, the orange rifle glinted in the fading light, resting across the veteran's shoulder. It had become a symbol of skill, of perseverance, of the extraordinary power of experience. And for the Marines who had mocked him that morning, it had become something else entirely, a lesson etched into memory, one that no amount of doubt or arrogance could erase. By nightfall, the story had already begun to spread beyond the base. Whispers of the shot reached training schools, forward operating bases, and even distant Pentagon offices. People spoke not just of the bullet, but of the veteran who had taken it, and the Marines who had witnessed history in the making. The legend of the orange rifle was born. The desert sky had turned a deep amber as the veteran walked slowly toward the edge of the training grounds. Dust rose around his boots, swirling in lazy spirals, catching the fading sunlight. His orange rifle rested comfortably across his shoulder, its paint chipped and dulled, but somehow more luminous than ever. It had earned its legend. Behind him, the Marines stood at the edge of the firing line, watching in silence. Some had tried to speak, but words failed them. They were no longer just recruits. They were witnesses to history, and they felt it in their bones. The general stepped forward, his shadow long against the sand. He stopped a few feet from the veteran, his voice calm but commanding. "You've done more than prove skill today. You've taught a lesson that no textbook can capture. These Marines, your students, will carry this memory into every mission, every range, every challenge. You've shown them the value of patience, experience, and precision under pressure." The veteran inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the words. His face betrayed nothing, yet the faintest hint of a smile touched the corners of his lips. He looked back at the Marines, who stood in formation, still silent, still awed. For them, the old man with the orange rifle had transformed from a figure of mockery into a living embodiment of what courage, skill, and endurance truly meant. One of the young Marines, unable to hold back, finally spoke. "Sir, will we ever see anything like that again?" The veteran's eyes flicked toward the distant steel target, now scarred with a perfect dent at its center. "Maybe," he said softly. "But what you saw wasn't about the shot. It was about understanding the moment, respecting the environment, trusting your instincts, and never underestimating what experience can teach you." Another Marine, the one who had made the foolish bet earlier, stepped forward. His voice was low, but earnest. "Sir, I owe you my respect. I laughed at you, and I shouldn't have." The veteran's gaze softened, though his expression remained firm. Respect isn't earned by words. It's earned by action. Learn from mistakes, carry the lesson forward, and don't make the same errors twice. The Marines absorbed his words, their pride humbled, their admiration cemented. They realized that they had been standing at the threshold of something rare, a moment that would shape their careers and their understanding of what it meant to be a Marine. The general gestured toward the horizon. "You've done your duty as a mentor and as a soldier. Go forward with the same discipline and calm you've shown today. Your impact will be felt long after you leave. The veteran nodded, his boots crunching against the gravel as he moved toward the exit. Each step carried weight, not of age, but of experience and history. Behind him, the Marines watched, the silence now filled with respect, awe, and a sense of reverence that would linger for years. The desert seemed to hold its breath as he walked. The sun dipped lower, casting a golden glow across the sand, illuminating the orange rifle in a way that appeared almost legendary. It was no longer a weapon. It was a symbol of discipline, precision, and a timeless power of skill honed over decades. As he reached the edge of the base, the veteran paused and glanced back one last time. The young Marines were still in formation, staring, taking in every detail. The general met his eyes and offered a not unspoken recognition that transcended words. The veteran lifted his rifle slightly in a subtle salute, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the evening haze. For the Marines left behind, the moment hung heavily in the air. Some whispered among themselves, recounting the shot, the precision, the calmness. Others simply stood in quiet reflection, realizing they had been given a rare gift, a glimpse into mastery that most soldiers would never see in a lifetime. One recruit finally broke the silence. I get it now. It's not the rifle. It's the man. Another nodded. Yeah, it's the discipline, the patience. Everything he's survived to be able to do that. The general observed them, satisfied. The lesson had been learned in the most powerful way possible, through action, not lecture. The story of the veteran, the orange rifle, and the 4,200-meter shot would be passed down through the ranks, whispered in training rooms and barracks, becoming part of Marine Corps lore. Far beyond 29 Palms, the Pentagon had begun to buzz with reports. Analysts debated, reporters speculated, and officers discussed incorporating elements of his technique into advanced training programs. Videos of the shot circulated, but none could fully capture the subtle mastery, the calm precision, the intuitive adjustments, the silent confidence that had made it possible. Back on the base, the young Marines began to file off the range, heads held higher, their understanding of the Corps forever altered. They would carry the lesson of respect, patience, and the power of experience into every mission. They would tell the story to new recruits, ensuring that the legend of the orange rifle endured. Even as night settled over the desert, a faint glow lingered on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. It seemed almost symbolic, a reminder that skill, courage, and mastery shine brightest when least expected. The veteran's footsteps faded into the distance, but his presence lingered in the minds and hearts of those who had witnessed him. The orange rifle, battered and bright, had become more than a tool. It was a legend in its own right, a symbol of what a single determined individual could achieve when experience, discipline, and calm courage aligned perfectly. And for every Marine who had stood there that day, the lesson was clear. Greatness isn't measured by age, appearance, or the gadgets you carry. It's measured by the mastery you've honed, the patience you've cultivated, and the courage you show when the moment demands it most. The story of the veteran, the orange rifle, and the impossible 4,200-meter shot would live on forever. Not just in reports, not just in whispers, not just in headlines, but in the hearts of the Marines who had witnessed it, carrying forward the enduring lesson of precision, patience, and respect for the craft. And in the desert of 29 Palms, under the fading light of a setting sun, a legend had walked away quietly, leaving behind a story that would never be forgotten.